Cartwrights had never been ones to believe in small-town superstitions. Fresh from the noise and chaos of the bustling city, Millstone felt like a breath of fresh air. Quiet, almost too quiet. The wide streets were lined with ancient oak trees whose gnarled branches seemed to creak like old bones in the autumn wind. There was something about Millstone, though, that felt different. It was the kind of town that breathed history, where quaint customs and folklore weren't just stories. They were gospel. People here took them seriously. The Cartwrights, Ben, Sarah, and their 2 children, Ellie and James, weren't used to traditions like this. In the city, Halloween was a time for plastic decorations, costumes, and candy. No one talked about guiding lost souls or ancient rituals. But as they quickly learned, Millstone was steeped in old-world beliefs. Their introduction to these beliefs came the day Father Jonathan appeared on their doorstep, a broad smile on his face, carrying a basket of fresh bread and homemade jams. A kindly man in his late 60s, Father Jonathan had pale skin, thinning white hair, and soft brown eyes that twinkled with warmth. The townspeople seemed to adore him, and his presence immediately put the Cartwrights at ease. "Welcome to Millstone," Father Jonathan said, handing the basket to Sarah. "We don't get many new families around here, but I promise you'll love it. The town is full of life and community spirit." "Thank you," Sarah said, accepting the basket with a warm smile. "Everyone has been so friendly." "We try to look out for one another," the priest replied. "Millstone is a bit of a hidden gem, but it's a special place. Our traditions are part of what make it so." He gestured around the quiet street. The houses were old but well-maintained, and the towering oaks that lined the road gave it an almost timeless quality. It was peaceful, serene, exactly what the Cartwrights had wanted when they decided to leave the city. "There's just one thing you should know," Father Jonathan said, his tone softening as though he was about to share a secret. "Here in Millstone, we observe a special tradition on Halloween. Every house in town places a candle on their doorstep. It's an old custom, brought over by the town's founders. The candle is said to guide the spirits of the dead safely through the night." Ben chuckled, glancing at Sarah. "Sounds like an old ghost story." Father Jonathan smiled kindly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Perhaps. But traditions matter here. The candle is important, and we take it seriously. I just wanted to make sure you knew." He paused for a moment, his eyes lingering on Ben. "Make sure you don't forget." Ben nodded politely, though he didn't think much of the warning. To him, it was just another quirky custom in a small town. Sarah, on the other hand, had a lingering sense of unease. The way Father Jonathan's voice had lowered when he mentioned the candle made her feel like there was more to the story. After the priest left, they went about settling into their new home. The kids were excited, running through the empty rooms, imagining where their things would go. Ellie, the older of the 2 at 10, had already claimed the biggest room, while James, 7, was content with his smaller space as long as he got to pick out the paint color. As the weeks passed, the Cartwrights met more of their neighbors, all of whom seemed friendly and welcoming. Mrs. Mallory, their elderly next-door neighbor, brought over a bundle of candles one afternoon. Her hands were shaking slightly as she handed them to Sarah. "For Halloween," she said, her voice soft and a little nervous. "It's important you have one. You don't want to be the only house without a candle." Sarah thanked her, though the mention of the candle sent a chill down her spine. The townspeople were starting to repeat themselves. It was as if the candle was more than just a tradition. It was a rule, something they had to follow. Mr. Henderson, who ran the local hardware store, brought it up too when Ben came in to buy paint for the kids' rooms. "You're the new folks, right?" Henderson asked, ringing up the supplies. "Got kids? 2 of them," Ben said. "Then you'll want to make sure you follow the Halloween tradition. Kids talk, you know. You don't want them to feel like outsiders." Ben smiled and nodded, but the conversation left him feeling unsettled. Even the children at Ellie and James's school seemed to whisper about the candle. Ellie had overheard a group of girls in the lunchroom talking about it. "If you don't light it, the spirits get confused," one of the girls said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They think you're one of them, and they come to take you away." By the time Halloween arrived, the Cartwrights had heard the story from nearly everyone in town. But despite all the warnings, they didn't take it seriously. To them, it was just an old legend, a silly superstition. They hadn't grown up in a place where people believed in ghosts and spirits. Halloween was a night for candy and costumes, nothing more. That evening, the streets of Millstone were filled with children dressed as witches, vampires, and ghosts, running from house to house, their laughter echoing down the quiet streets. Ellie and James were no exception. Ellie was a witch, her pointy hat slipping over her eyes, and James was a vampire, constantly pulling out his plastic fangs because they hurt his gums. Ben and Sarah stood at the door, handing out candy and watching the neighborhood come to life. The houses were decorated with glowing jack-o'-lanterns, cobwebs, and skeletons. But what struck Sarah was the candles. Every house had one on their doorstep, its flame flickering in the cool autumn breeze. Every house but theirs. It wasn't intentional. They had simply forgotten. In the excitement of the night, getting the kids into their costumes, answering the door for trick-or-treaters, they hadn't thought about it. The night passed quickly, and by the time the kids were tucked into bed, the streets had fallen silent. It wasn't until Sarah was climbing into bed herself that she remembered. "The candle," she said suddenly, sitting up. "We forgot to light the candle." Ben, already half asleep, rolled over with a groan. "We'll survive one Halloween without it." But they wouldn't. That night, Ellie was the first to notice something was wrong. She woke in the middle of the night, her room icy cold, far colder than it should have been, even for late October. She pulled the blankets tighter around her, but the chill seemed to seep into her bones. Then she heard it, a faint scraping sound. At first it was so soft she thought it was the wind. But as she lay there listening, it grew louder. It was coming from her closet. Her heart raced as she sat up, staring at the closet door. She was sure it had been closed when she went to bed, but now it was slightly ajar. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. Ellie wanted to scream for her parents, but something inside her told her to stay quiet. Her breath caught in her throat as the closet door creaked open a little wider. A shadow shifted in the darkness, slipping out of the closet and onto the floor. It was low, crawling, inching closer to her bed. Ellie froze, her body rigid with fear, her voice stuck in her throat. The shadow stopped at the foot of her bed, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then it spoke, a voice like dead leaves rustling in the wind. "You forgot the candle!" Ellie screamed, the sound shattering the stillness of the night. Ben and Sarah were at her side in seconds, finding her trembling, pointing at the closet door. "Someone was in my room," she stammered, tears streaming down her face. Ben flicked on the light and checked the closet. Empty. "Ellie, it was just a bad dream." But even as he said it, the room felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with something he couldn't explain. Cold lingered in the corners, and the sense of being watched was impossible to shake. "I saw something," Ellie whispered, her voice shaking. "It said we forgot the candle." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard the stories, but they were just stories, weren't they? The townspeople couldn't really believe that a candle would keep spirits at bay. Could they? "We should light one," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling, "just in case." Ben, too tired to argue, retrieved one of the candles Mrs. Mallory had given them. He struck a match, and the moment the flame flickered to life, the air seemed to shift. The oppressive feeling lifted slightly, though the cold remained. But it was already too late. The next morning, things began to go wrong. Objects moved on their own. Chairs scraped across the floor. Picture frames fell from the walls with no explanation. Cold spots lingered in corners of the house, no matter how high the heat was turned up. And then there were the whispers. Faint at first, barely audible, like a soft murmur. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "You forgot the candle." Ben and Sarah tried to explain it away. The house was old. Maybe it was just settling. Maybe the cold was a draft they hadn't noticed before. But deep down, they knew something was wrong. The house felt alive, as though it was watching them. The children became more unsettled each night, waking up with vague memories of shadows and cold hands brushing against them. It was happening too often, too consistently to be coincidence. 3 days after Halloween, just after midnight, the doorbell rang. Ben and Sarah exchanged nervous glances. No one would be out at this hour. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, as though someone was holding their finger on the button. Ben hesitated, then went to the door. He opened it slowly, cautiously, expecting to find no one. But there was someone. Standing on the porch was Father Jonathan, holding a candle in his hand. His warm, kind smile was gone, replaced by a cold, almost cruel expression. Behind him, the Cartwright's neighbors stood in a circle, each holding a candle of their own. Mrs. Mallory, Mr. Henderson, the other friendly faces they had met over the past few weeks, all standing in eerie silence, their candles flickering in unison. What is this? Ben stammered, stepping back. Father Jonathan smiled, but it was a smile devoid of any warmth. We warned you, he said softly. The candle is not just a tradition, it's a rule. Sarah appeared behind Ben, her face pale as she took in the sight of the townspeople standing together in the dark, their faces blank, eyes cold. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. You did all of this? The cold, the whispers? Father Jonathan nodded, stepping forward. Millstone is not just any town. We have our ways. The candle is not to honor the dead. It is to protect the living. You ignored our tradition, and now you must be reminded. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. Reminded of what? The priest raised his candle higher, and the townspeople did the same, their movements perfectly synchronized. Of the consequences, Father Jonathan said, his voice low and threatening. This was your warning. Next time, we will take something more. Ben felt a chill run down his spine as the group began to step back into the darkness, their candles slowly vanishing into the night. Father Jonathan's final words echoed in his mind. This was just the beginning.